Have you ever wondered why governments seem to screw up everything they touch? Well, there's three basic reasons. Let's dive into them. Hi, my name is Tyus. I make videos about personal liberty, living your freest life and escaping the rat race. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do so right now. And stay to the end of this video because not only am I going to explain why the government seems to screw up everything they get their hands on, but I'm going to share with you how you can avoid making the exact same mistakes those governments do. Now, there's three primary ways that the government seems to mess up everything they get their hands on. Those are apathy, evil, and incompetence. Apathy being poor incentive structures, evil being the lies that politicians say to gain power or money for themselves, and incompetence is something that we're going to dive much deeper in this video, and I'm going to explore something called the COBRA effect that I find absolutely fascinating. But let's take a moment to look at apathy. Apathy being poor incentive. So if you go to the DMV, there's a reason the line is going out the door and around the block and it takes forever to get through it. It's done that way because nobody seems to care. They get the work whether you're there or not. They get the same paycheck whether they do it fast or slow. They're just not incentivized, so they're apathetic about their job. You see the same thing with road construction. It seems to take forever to get anything done, and it's because the job is the job. They're going to get paid regardless by the hour, whatever. They don't seem to care enough about doing it because their heart's just not in it. The second reason the governments mess up everything they put their hands on is because, well, evil. Politicians lie, and unfortunately politicians seem to do it at a disproportionate amount to everybody else, and when they lie it has massive consequences, whether that is economic or worse, costing a lot of lives. And we know this happens a lot, whether it's the Bay of Tonkin or the Iran-Contra scandal or Iraq's weapons of mass destruction that we were sold on that sent us to war, or the NSA doing mass surveillance on citizens that Snowden exposed to us, or Guantanamo Bay and how we hold people without trial and torture them, or the Federal Reserve Bank, which I did a whole video on the Federal Reserve Bank. It's fascinating, and I will link it right up here. So that's the second reason that they mess things up. But the third reason I find really, really fascinating, we all know that politicians lie. The third reason is something called the COBRA effect. A long, long time ago, when the initial British colonization of India was taking place, there was all of these poisonous snakes around, and they didn't want to deal with these snakes. So they came up with a brilliant idea. They said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to put a bounty on these snakes. So the people will go out there, they'll kill them, we won't have to deal with all the deadly snakes. And you know what happened? Well, it worked initially. Initially, people went out and started killing snakes, and they got paid. And when they got paid, they went, hey, you know what, there's a paycheck in this, I like this. So people started farming snakes. They started raising snakes and breeding snakes so that they could have a bunch of snakes that they could then kill and turn in for money when they needed money. So the government got wind of this. They're like, oh my gosh, this is not what we intended to have happen. The program stopped, and as soon as they stopped the bounty, everybody said, okay, we don't need to farm these snakes anymore, so they released the snakes. So the goal was to reduce the snake population, and the end outcome was they massively increased the snake population. And this is where we get the term the COBRA effect. It would be nice to assume that we learned our lesson from this, but of course we didn't. Hanoi, under French colonization rule, they wanted to get rid of all of the rats, so they put out a bounty on those rats. And you didn't even have to turn in the dead rat, you only needed to turn in the dead rat's tail. So people went out and they found rats, and they didn't kill the rats, they cut off their tails. The rats were let free to go and breed and create more rats. Those people turned in the tails and got their bounty, and people eventually started farming rats, and the same problem occurred. This also happened in Fort Benning, Georgia, where they had a problem with feral pigs. They asked for the tails of those pigs, and the exact same thing occurred. These are examples of the COBRA effect, but the COBRA effect is not just related to bounties. A more modernized version of the COBRA effect is called the STRIESAND effect, which comes from a situation in 2003 when Barbra Streisand sued a company called Pictopia.com for publishing photos of her house. Barbra Streisand was afraid that once the house pictures were out there, people were going to get them, they were going to find out where she lived, she was going to have a bunch of crazy fans and stalkers show up. But right before publishing the lawsuit, only 6 people had downloaded the photos, and 2 of which were her own attorneys. So nobody had even seen these photos, really. But the lawsuit brought tremendous attention to the photos, and people flooded to the website, and about 5,420,000 people downloaded the photos. That's where we get the name the Streisand effect, which is just another name for the COBRA effect, which is unintended consequences or shooting yourself in the foot. Now, unlike a civil lawsuit, the government has much bigger consequences when they make mistakes like the COBRA effect. So for example, in 1980, the USA funded Afghan fighters to fight against the Soviet Union. The US's goal was specifically to end the war in the Middle East, but what ended up actually happening was the United States funded bin Laden. And of course, the consequences of that are 9/11 and the United States entering into the war in the Middle East and perpetuating it. We actually had the opposite effect of what we wanted to accomplish. Another example of this is the war on drugs started in 1971. Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy #1. Of course, the goal being to reduce drug abuse, but the actual impact was the opposite, because by making drugs so felonious, you created more felons. And by doing that, you reduce people's freedom, the opposite of what I want this YouTube channel to be about. So when their freedoms were reduced, they had less opportunity for education, they had less opportunity for employment, they lost their right to vote. And so they're so constricted that the real only option to make a good income is to get involved in the drug trade, which perpetuated it and made it worse. It also created a huge black market, which generated the violent drug cartels that still exist today. A third example is abstinence-only education, which was initiated in many states' public education programs. The goal was to reduce STIs or STDs, I'm not sure which one you call it now, sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections. I'm not sure why we need to have two versions of that. And it was also there to reduce pregnancies. But ultimately, they didn't teach kids about contraception and everything they need to know around sex, so pregnancies increase. STIs and STDs increase. It did the exact opposite of what they wanted. The takeaway here is that incentives work, but you gotta be really careful with what you're choosing to incentivize. You've got to identify the problem and actually go after the problem, not try to remedy it through a backdoor channel. For example, the NFL, they were having a giant problem, they still have a giant problem with CTE, which stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, basically brain damage. People were getting hit, they were getting brain damage, so they needed to fix it. So what did the NFL do? Well, they commissioned people to make better helmets, better pads. And what was the result? Well, they didn't incentivize people to treat each other better or produce less violence within the sport. So people started using these better helmets as weapons. They used these better pads to hit each other harder, and the CTE got worse. Another example of this could be minimum wage, which I won't go into all the details on minimum wage because I made a video about it and you can check it out. But minimum wage, people think it's there to help protect the poor. In reality, it absolutely devastates the poorest among us. It does the exact opposite of its intent. I hope you're enjoying these videos. I certainly enjoy making them. I can come out with a new one every single Monday and Friday. So if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you want to share these with anybody who is like-minded or different-minded and wants to learn something new, then please share it with them. And I hope to see you on the next video.